All right, welcome to everyone that is joining. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes for people to dial in. Popular topic today, I think.
Popular panel.
Wouldn't go quite that far.
It's been ages since you and I have had a chat in this level of detail.
I know. I'm excited to hear your thoughts. For those just joining, we'll be kicking off shortly. We're just waiting for everyone to dial in. All right, it is 1 minute past, so maybe I'll kick off with a little bit of housekeeping while everyone else joins us. Good morning, everyone. Thank you ever so much for taking the time to dial in today. We are going to be talking about Gen Z in the workplace, which seems to be a popular topic, and in particular, what small businesses can do to attract, engage, retain, and really get the best out of that generation of talent. For anyone that doesn't know me, my name is Kate. I head up our talent acquisition team at Employment Hero, and I'm joined today by David Holland, affectionately known as Dutchy, who is our Managing Director of Talent Solutions. Now, just before we sort of get into the discussion, bit of housekeeping. Firstly, I'll note that today's topic is obviously based on trying to understand an entire subset of the population. So we are going to be making some pretty hefty generalizations. These are based on data that we've gathered both independently from the Employment Hero Jobs Report, or in a few instances, it might be sort of reputable third parties. But obviously, we're going to have to make some generalizations in order to have this discussion. A little bit more housekeeping. We've got some time allocated at the end of the webinar for your questions. Please type your questions in the box down at the bottom of your Zoom screens, and we'll get to as many as we can after the presentation. But for those that we don't get to, we'll endeavour to answer after the webinar. And finally, today's session is being recorded as always, and both the recording and slides will be made available after the webinar has concluded. So with that done, I think let's get into it. We are going to kick off with a poll, as we often do, just to help inform our discussion today and also give you guys, I suppose, some data as well. So the first poll should be popping up on your screen now. And the question is, what's your biggest barrier to attracting and retaining Gen Z talent? And the options are outdated work practices, leadership mindsets resistant to change, lack of understanding about Gen Z's values, or actually, we think we do this pretty well. So while that poll runs, maybe we'll start off with some basics just to frame the conversation, Dutchy. So who are Gen Z?
Um, who are they? Yes. Well, I think definitionally it's pretty clear. They're defined as those who were born between 1997 and 2012, which means today they're between 13 and 28. And just to establish my credentials, I'm father of three Gen Z who are currently navigating their way through not only their first jobs, but their studies. Those jobs range from washing dishes in a cafe and waiting tables through to some fairly ambitious activities around tutoring and things like that. So I have three 19-year-olds who are bang in the middle of that 13 to 28 range. So that's what I'm doing. Do you want to talk a little bit about where they sit in the workforce today?
Yeah, so they currently make up 26.5% of the workforce. So just for context for everyone, millennials make up the biggest portion of the workforce today still, which is sitting at 35.6%. But this is all about to change, hence the conversation today. So in just 4 years, Gen Z will overtake millennials and fast become the largest generation in the workforce. And they bring some quite distinct values and expectations, I suppose I'd say, around purpose, flexibility, and technology that are really reshaping kind of hiring, retention, and workplace culture. So, for SMEs that are really serious about attracting and retaining top talent, I think understanding Gen Z is no longer optional, it's going to become pretty essential. Hence, why we're here today. We'll kick off with the results from the poll. So, lack of understanding about Gen Z's values was the most popular response, followed by leadership mindsets resistant to change, which is interesting. So we'll certainly be covering off today what some of Gen Z's values and motivations are, along with maybe what organizations can do practically to make sure that they are meeting those needs. All right. Well, Dutchy, maybe let's start off with the basics. So, why is Gen Z such a hot topic in the workforce today? And how do they differ from previous generations? I think that's the burning question that everyone's got. How are they different? What are they looking for? Why is it maybe different than the millennials or generations above that?
Yeah, well, I think let's address those in two parts. Why are they a hot topic? I mean, there's an obvious answer to this, which is they're new. They are the emerging workforce, and as you said, they're already over a quarter of the workforce. And the fact that within 4 years they're going to become the single largest generation inside the next 4 years, that means we've all got to sit up and take notice of this if we're not already doing so. So I think that's part of the buzz is they're new. Part of the buzz is that they're the emerging force. But I think the other element that comes into this, which is perhaps unique to this generation, um, is very much about the fact that we're undergoing so it's simultaneously a generational change whilst we're undergoing one of the biggest changes in how we work. You know, from 2020 and the impact of the pandemic through to the technology that is currently enabling and driving so much change in the way we work, how we go about our jobs, how we go about our careers, how we go about our learning. I think that's really compounded it. And without wanting to make too much of a point of it, the global macro uncertainty, geopolitical, globalization, ongoing climate conversations, these are all things that really impact the way not just Gen Z, but we all think about our jobs and our careers. So I think it's that combination. They are the emerging generation at a time of potentially unparalleled change, which is actually an interesting segue into the second half of that question, which is how are they different to previous generations? I actually was looking at some analysis on this with a view to establishing that these were the greatest changes in environments, the global environment, how we work. And interestingly, the comparison is back to the boomers and that pre-war, post-war that my parents, as a Gen X, my parents went through. The work environment that generation came into was just fundamentally different to the work environment that their parents had experienced, which hadn't really changed much for probably hundreds of years. The emergence of a female workforce through the war and the continuation of that through the 50s and 60s, the emergence, the very early stages of technology starting to impact the way they worked and the jobs that they were doing. There was a lot of conversation about the fear of whole industries being put out of work. That was interesting that this generation of Gen Z are coming into the workforce with a similar level of disruption. So I think, the question in my mind was this a revolution or an evolution? And I was leaning towards evolution. This is just another generational change. We had the same conversation when millennials, I can remember the emergence of millennials, Kate. I was once a younger person. I've observed those changes before. And I was really trying to say, is there something different about this group? And I was leaning towards no. And then I realized that actually, yeah, this is pretty fundamental. We can get into some of what the specifics are there, but I do think that they are different to previous generations, going all the way back to potentially to boomers. And if you want to, we can jump into some specific things, but the one that really stands out for me is multitasking. Um, we see it in some ways we classify as negative, which is multiple consumption of simultaneous content. And what I refer to there is I will walk into my kids' bedrooms when they lived at home. They'll be on the laptop. They'll have the phone beside them with a chat going, and the music will be playing in the background. And for me, that just blew my mind that that could be effective. And perhaps it wasn't effective, but they've certainly grown up with this idea of multitasking. I don't know how you react to that.
Yeah, it's absolutely correct. They have, and that is reflected in EH Jobs report. So maybe let's talk briefly about some of the data there around polyemployment. Can you maybe share a couple of stats around that? Because I think it absolutely validates everything that you've just articulated, but in a professional context as well.
Yeah, well, I think, in terms of the stats, well, starting with the insights report, the big stats are the ones that reinforce our opening remarks, which is that the Gen Z hiring is surging at the moment. They're obviously just coming into the workforce now. Some of them are still at high school. So over the next few years, we're going to see their emergence. And so we've seen nearly 18% year-on-year growth in the hiring of Gen Z just by quantum. And that's not surprising. That's maths. That's the fact that, funnily enough, boomers are probably not getting as many jobs, and they probably don't want as many jobs as they used to. And that's mathematically the case. So, that 18% year-on-year growth that comes out of the Employment Hero Insights report, Employment and Jobs report. Um, we're increasingly hiring. The flip side of that is that businesses are increasingly hiring Gen Z. Again, mathematically correct, but I think it's also driven by, we'll come on to flexibility, but I think from an employer's perspective, there are different businesses emerging that appreciate or demand the flexibility that Gen Z also seem to be so comfortable with. We'll probably come on to that. But the point you raise about polyemployment, that really has surged. I'm going to let you talk about what polyemployment is, but we've seen a 19% year-on-year increase off already fast escalating numbers of people having multiple occupations. And I'm going to stop there, Kate, because I want you to talk about polyemployment.
Sure, yeah. So polyemployment is literally just a trend of people having multiple jobs simultaneously. So it might be that they have got, several jobs because they have pick up shifts maybe with several different local employers if they're younger and they're working while they're at school or at university or whatever the case might be. Or it might be different. It might be that they've got like a full-time job during the week, but then there's also something different that they do in the evenings or at the weekends or as a bit of a side hustle effectively. And we're certainly seeing that that is becoming increasingly popular with Gen Z specifically, which is interesting.
Yeah. And I want for our audience, I really want to emphasize this point, which is, and we were chatting about this offline before, Kate, but I recently spent the long weekend with my children and 3+1s of all the same age. And what became abundantly apparent to me is they don't see polyemployment as side hustles. That's a Gen X term, with all due respect, Kate. The side hustle was something that some people did in addition to their job. I looked across those young adults, and what I noticed amongst them is it comes back to this point, that ability to simultaneously consume multiple content. They don't see that they will comfortably have full-time study, a job that pays regular wages. They're all starting to think, if they haven't started their own business, side hustle, they're already thinking about it. Some of them have tried and failed and they're trying again. Their mindset is not that that's doing multiple things. That is just the way they are. So they are just completely organically, natively engaged in the polyemployment market. And so as employers, and it's the spearhead of our talent acquisition. I'm sure you see this with the applicants that we deal with for our business. We need to understand that this is the way things are now. We are not going to convince these people to take a full-time job at the exclusion of all these other things that we call side hustles. It used to be there were hobbies, and hobbies were healthy because they were a break and they helped you rejuvenate and reset. They are quite comfortable running a business, having obligations around, tutoring, around full additional jobs that pay salaries. That's just the way they are. And I think we really need to accept that that's going to become a bigger feature of our workforce, not a smaller one.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, I want to get into probably quite a juicy topic and one that I'm sure that a lot of the listeners will be curious to hear about, which is what are the biggest misconceptions and concerns that leaders have about Gen Z? And to be honest, how justified are they or aren't they?
Yeah, well, you did mention at the outset. Now I understand why, about the fact that we're going to be generalizing. It's absolutely the case that this generation is no different to every generation that came before them. There are different people. And I know that there has been a temptation in the past to label this generation as distracted, entitled, lazy, all these negative connotations. And look, those people exist in the generation, perhaps just as prevalent as it was in previous generations. And so I think we need to be very careful about those labels, because what we see as that sort of distracted behavior that I was talking about before, when I can walk into my kid's bedroom and see them studying whilst listening to the radio and having a group chat discussion on the phone. That again is the way they work. It's the way they've been brought up. They're very comfortable with that approach. So we mustn't confuse that kind of behavior and that approach to work and life as being lazy and distracted. Um, they're just motivated by different things. They're not motivated necessarily by the same things we were, and that's a function of the world that they're growing up in, irrespective of what you might personally believe about climate and the environment. Their world is very wedded to that. So if they bring and I can bring in a bunch of social topics around that, which I won't label because I think we could go down some rabbit holes there. But that inclusiveness that this generation drive for, whether or not you think that's a good thing or a bad thing or a great thing, that's what they're bringing to the workforce. They want to bring their values, which are slightly different to ours because, not surprisingly, they're growing up in a different world. They want to bring their approach to technology and multitasking, and they want to bring that more entrepreneurial, open mindset to businesses. So I think the first misconception is that they're lazy, distracted, and unfocused, entitled. I think the better way to label that is they are curious, motivated by different things, and that sense of entitlement, I think, is reflected by the fact that they are financially savvy. I think that's where that comes from. I'd be interested in your views because I know salary in talent acquisition recruitment, salary is an important topic. Have you noticed a difference between, a couple of years ago and today, the beginning of your career and today, in terms of where salary ranks in those conversations?
Yeah, I think it's always been a really important topic, but I think it's probably become increasingly so for Gen Z, particularly if you're hiring at graduate level and beyond. And what often comes out in surveys when they are surveying attitudes and what's important to Gen Z, cost of living is weighing on them enormously. And often I think that we're probably questioning as an older generation, oh, well, wages have gone up, salaries have gone up. You would earn way more as a graduate than I did when I was a graduate. So why are you so concerned about cost of living? And my assumption is that actually, like, probably for a lot of major cities, but like especially throughout the majority of Australia, to be honest, while wages have gone up, the average income to house price ratio in particular is increasingly shocking. So house prices in most cities in Australia have gone up like 3,000 to 4,000% since the 70s, but wages obviously haven't. So even if to us it feels as though wages have come a long way, I think it's stats like that that maybe they're increasingly cognizant of. And as you said, trying to be more financially savvy. And for them, I think time is a really big investment. And if they're putting in however many hours worth of work a week, they want to make sure that they're being appropriately compensated for both the hours and the level of effort.
Yeah, they definitely really value their time, which, perhaps we all did, but they've got a lot more things to fill their time with, some of them valuable, some of them less than, me being kicked out of the house to go and run around the neighborhood from, 3:30 till 8 o'clock at night. I didn't necessarily think a lot about work and how valuable my time was. But so we've talked about one of the main myths, which I think is this fact that they're lazy, distracted, perhaps entitled. And I think it's they're motivated, curious, and aware of their value, the value of their time. One of the things that I think is pretty generally accepted for Gen Z is this whole flexibility, this whole idea around flexibility. So let's dive into that. We talked about polyemployment, but I think and that just having lots of different priorities and values that they want to pursue, and that can go through to I've seen it again firsthand recently, participation in not-for-profits. I think we're seeing this generation really engaging in things that they find important, social initiatives, environmental initiatives, sports and clubs and hobbies. But the flexibility goes beyond that. And we're going to get into the whole topic of remote work, remote flexible hours, working to, what's the expression we always use, working in the way that best suits my productivity. Again, it's absolutely the case that this generation, they went to school through the pandemic. We asked them as students, as a society, we asked our students to be hyper flexible. And again, I saw that firsthand. My kids were sort of halfway through high school at that point, coming into the sort of starting of the serious part of school. And we demanded, or that didn't demand, they just had to get on board with an entirely different way of education, completely foreign to what I grew up with, what you grew up with. Going to school, into class at 8:30, back-to-back classes, and out at 3 o'clock. We asked them to go to their rooms. We asked them to log on online. We asked them to use technology that is bread and butter for us today. We don't think twice about jumping on a Zoom call or a G Meet. We were watching these kids adopt this technology and change their ways of learning, and still expecting them to grow and evolve and learn. So as they enter the workforce, it's not surprising that they're used to doing things a little differently and used to doing it a little bit more flexibly. So what does that mean? Well, should we talk about hybrid versus remote? Hybrid, the request. We're a little different, Kate. So we're fully remote. So you're dealing with people who, do you see applicants? We attract more applicants looking for that full remote environment versus hybrid?
Yes, typically yes. So we're fully remote. So for anyone that's not familiar with Employment Heroes setup, people work majority of the time 100% from home, and they're in different states and countries and time zones, and we're very kind of geographically dispersed. So we've adopted a few different things that have made us much more effective when working in that model. I think there are a huge segment of talent that are really interested in that, and it's specifically what they're looking for. But the other request is often for hybrid, and typically that would be coming, anecdotally based on our own experience from younger employees who maybe their ideal scenario would be they get a really good amount of flexibility because they can be remote when they want to be and when it suits them. But if they want to get something like more of a social connection from going into the office or into a hub, then they can do that as well. So I think hybrid and remote tends to be particularly popular. Obviously, that is not possible for everyone, depending on what industry you operate within and maybe the specifics of your business. So I'll just note that when we talk about flexibility, we don't purely mean remote or hybrid. Yes, that's an aspect of it, but I think there are a multitude of ways that you can offer flex.
Yeah, and just as a really good example, some people prefer to start work at 7 a.m. and finish at 3 p.m. Others prefer to start at 10 and finish at 7. Don't judge that. That's just part of the way this generation's working. I just coming back into flexibility, whether it is different flexible starting times and working times, whether it's location. I think the number one thing that Employment Hero has learned and that we're consistent about is you want to come into this conversation deliberately. And I think what I see with people who say, oh, remote didn't work for us, flexible didn't work for us, is because they introduced these policies. They thought, fantastic, we're going to be really great here. We're going to allow people to work from home 1 day a week, or we're going to allow people to start late and work late. You have to recognize that the habits, the way we manage businesses up until the last 10 years has been formed over literally hundreds of years. And I'm talking primarily about office-based knowledge work, obviously construction, healthcare, hospitality, retail, site-based jobs, slightly different opportunities there. But in terms of businesses that are managing knowledge workforces, that habit has been built up over hundreds of years. The first offices emerged in Amsterdam in like the 1700s, and coming into a desk and sitting down and being supervised, physically visible to a manager was the way we evolved. You can't suddenly just go, okay, you can now work from home 1 day a week and not change the infrastructure, not consider the infrastructure that you provide to make that a success. And I talk about three types of infrastructure. We need the physical infrastructure, so everyone gets a good chair, a good desk, a good laptop and monitor setup. That's the physical infrastructure. And again, I can point to examples in my life where some businesses that I see their employees working from home and they literally are scrunched up at a desk with a tiny little laptop. And I think that's not the way to do that. We invest in the technological infrastructure, so the tools. So, how are you going to deal with async communication? How are you going to deal with productivity and monitoring and that kind of stuff? And again, embrace the Gen Zs because they have the answers to this. They want to work, they want to be productive. They're used to being in a remote, flexible environment. Look to the answer, look to them for the answers, but do it deliberately, do it in a considered way. Don't just open the floodgates and expect it all to work. And then the third infrastructure is the cultural infrastructure. And we could really talk about our experience on this, but we've invested really deliberately and intensively in our cadence, in our meetups, in the way in which we communicate from an ELT, from the various teams to other teams. We work really hard on that. So I think any conversation around flexibility, which is relevant to Gen Z, to bring it back to today's conversation, look to do it deliberately. If you want more content on that, we've got tons of webinars, tons of white papers on our website. You can go and search through the resources and just type in remote, and you'll get tons of checks, from checklists to case studies and how we do it. So that's probably enough around flexibility. The other element I just want to touch on is cost, wages. Historically, particularly in Australia, with the way our youth awards and minimum wages work, we've some businesses have often looked towards 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds, right up to actually weirdly 20-year-olds who are on sub-adult wages. They've looked to those generations as an economic, a lower cost alternative. Now, I would say there's a ton of reasons to invest in 16, 17, and 18-year-olds, to invest in school leavers, to invest in graduates. And it's about bringing in fresh talent. We should talk about that and investing in those people and growing them. But I don't think that cost savings, if cost savings is your driving force, it's very temporary. It might be 2 or 3 years that you're going to benefit from that. You're better off building your teams based on the long term than the short term. But and to that point, we've actually seen, and again, I'll probably look to you for analysis on the data, but we've seen some pretty big relative outperformance in wage rises at that junior level. So some of this cost element might actually be disappearing, Kate.
Yes, yeah. So based on our Employment Hero Jobs report, which is dropping officially next week, I believe, we know that 14 to 17-year-olds saw 8.2% year-on-year wage growth increase, which is the highest of any age group. So super interesting that that age classification in particular saw the biggest growth based on the exact stat that you just mentioned.
Yeah, and so that, I think look, there's a number of reasons for that. Part of it is regulatory. There are moves to eliminate youth discounts, or at least close the gap to the adult wage and lower the age threshold that the adult wage kicks in. There's there's demand. So I mentioned it earlier, but again, we're seeing through the Insights report the number of casual hours is rising. I'm not sure I've got the exact percentage to my eye at the moment, but the number of hours that are being worked on a casual basis are actually increasing faster, therefore, as an overall percentage. And of course, casual wages are higher than permanent wages, part-time or full-time permanent wages. So again, I think some of that increased cost is definitely being driven by an increased casualization of the workforce. And that, of course, links back to this generation's desire for flexibility. They're going to keep casual jobs longer, potentially, would be a hypothesis I'd have. They're going to keep that casual job longer because they might be investing in a sporting activity, a hobby, a side hustle, or entrepreneurship longer through study, beyond study, into their early stage of their careers. They're prepared to back themselves more than any generation before. So, yeah, I think unpacking when the report comes out next week, make sure you grab a copy, because I think you can start to unpack some really interesting trends around this generation.
I
What?
just I just want to summarize because I'm conscious of what the poll results were, and maybe I'll tie it up in a nice bow for anyone that was hoping to get a response on that from this particular. So just to summarize what we've talked about so far, things that motivate Gen Z, and then we'll talk maybe a little bit more about how you can actually incorporate that into your EVP. So polyemployment is a big trend, this desire to have maybe multiple things on the go at the same time and needing to accommodate for that. Flexibility is a big theme, whether it's remote work, hybrid, flexing hours, flexing being able to have multiple roles at the same time. That flexibility piece is big. Work-life balance is really important to them. They know their value and they will negotiate on things like salary and benefits, and you ought to be prepared for that. And also leaving them time for initiatives that they're passionate about, which I think links back to work-life balance. That would be my synopsis of some of the key motivations.
Yeah, and then just flipping that round, I know we're going to come on to EVP, but from an employer's perspective, we need to embrace Gen Z, partly because they're coming. they're going to be they're the biggest source of new talent into the marketplace. We went through the maths on that, but also they bring the freshest ideas. And if you're in an industry that's going to be touched by AI, if you're going to be, and which industry isn't, I think we can argue that for another day, but they're bringing in that native technology familiarity. And I think we've always had, Kate, as you know, particularly Dave Tong, one of our co-founders, has been a big proponent of investing in graduates and helping build their careers and investing in them heavily. It's never been more important because I think this new generation, even compared to your generation, Kate, are going to bring this fresh approach to talent. So if you're gonna if you don't want to engage with Gen Z, in spite of the fact they're going to be the biggest cohort soon, embrace with them because they're going to bring the solutions to the problems the challenges we have as businesses.
Yeah, and I think even if you're in, retail, wholesale, consumer goods, whatever, we also have to keep in mind that that's suddenly going to be a big segment of the audience that you're potentially selling to and your potential customers. And if you don't have anyone in the organization that is of that age group and can understand that mindset and maybe bring that perspective to your business, then I think potentially you're missing out. But let's
Sorry, Kate, just one thing before we jump into EVP. Have we got Q&A turned on? I think we forgot to mention it. We've got hundreds of people on the call. Are people able to ask questions in real time?
Yeah, people should be able to ask questions in the Q&A
Amazing.
box. So please, it's down at the bottom of your screens. Please go ahead if there's anything that
And
you
just like that. There we go. Okay, sorry, Kate. EVP.
All good, all good.
They
So yes,
come.
EVP. Let's talk about how small businesses can tailor their EVP and company culture to genuinely attract and retain Gen Z talent. So, are there any comments in particular that you'd like to make on this subject, Dutchy? Because I've got several.
Well, I'll probably set this up for you, but personally, Um, I think you know that I'm on all the cutting edge trends myself, as you know, Kate. But I think my number one point here is don't follow the fads. You need to be, whatever you do, do it genuinely. It's a bit like, be deliberate about your approach to flexible work. Be genuine and thoughtful about what you do here in terms of values. It's not a throwaway line on your website or your EVP. So I think culture is going to be a big part of this, Kate, but I'm probably more interested in what you have to say on this topic. I'm going to throw back to you.
Sure. Yeah. So I've got several points that I think are critical based on the research that we've done and I suppose my own experience. So I would start with like how and where to attract Gen Z. We know for a fact that they value their time. We've already talked about this, and they hate filling out really long-winded application forms, and they want the process to be respectful of their time. So that is, for example, one of multiple reasons why when we were designing Smart Match, we were really, really cognizant about what we were asking of the job seeker. They create a single profile and then they're matched with multiple opportunities. They're not filling out the same Q&A with every single application that they put out there. So that's something to consider. Like, make sure that you're going to where Gen Z are actually spending their time, if that's the group of talent that you're trying to attract, and make sure that you are using a forward thinking and I would say probably more tech savvy and less time intensive application process if that's the category of talent that you're wanting to scoop up. So after you've done that, I would then start switching gears and thinking about your EVP. For anyone that's not familiar with that concept, it's basically thinking about what are you offering to this person or to this talent pool that would make them select your business over another employer. That's basically it in a nutshell. So there's a lot of data which we've talked about or referenced throughout the call already around kind of what motivates Gen Z. But in particular, there are a lot of different themes that come through in Deloitte's 2025 Gen Z and Millennial survey. So maybe I'll just briefly reference a couple of those things. Their strongest reasons for selecting their current employers are work-life balance, opportunities to progress, and learning and development. So I'd say if you haven't thought about those three things or you don't know what you're doing in those three areas, then that's a really good place to start. And we also talked about cost of living being a top concern and why that might be a consideration for them. So we can safely say that salary and benefits are a factor. And I think that any benefits that really help with cost of living are super valuable. We know that work-life balance and well-being is a factor. So maybe let's talk about what you could do if you can't offer remote or if you can't offer hybrid. What are some other things that you could do in terms of flexibility and supporting well-being that we think that that generation in particular would value? So one would be emphasizing outcomes-based performance rather than time-based inputs. Things like OKRs can really help with that. Employment Hero has got OKRs on the platform. If you haven't tried them, that might be a really good way of keeping track of a more performance-based culture rather than time-based inputs. We've talked about hybrid and remote where it's possible. I would also really consider investing in some sort of employee well-being program. So it could be something like fitness membership, could be a really comprehensive EAP, anything along those lines, I think, that will ease with their well-being and the perception of how much work-life balance they're getting. And then the final thing I'd note is just reducing unnecessary workload that doesn't actually move the needle. So, for example, if you are not actually adopting AI or investing in the right tech stack and you haven't got the right platforms and tools for your organization, and your employees are spending a huge amount of time on admin and lots of busy work that doesn't actually drive the organization forward, strongly recommend rethinking that, because just by, investing in the right tech, embracing AI, all of that good stuff, you're potentially going to give all of your team members several hours back in their days. And that's really going to play into this perception of flexibility and work-life balance.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, and I'm starting to regret also asking for questions because there's some questions come through which we'll try and get to. One thing that we should talk about is that with people with this generation having, in terms of retention, they're obviously, we've identified they're having more jobs in their careers than our generations or generations before us. So tenure, length of the retention and length of tenure. If we are going to invest heavily in these employees to make them productive in our jobs, I'm going to come back to the question, which is the entry level skills gap. How do we solve for that in a flexible remote environment, technology enabled environment? But let's assume that we have spent the first 2 years of their graduate or post school leaver life investing in them. It's really important that we retain them. And I think before I talk about addressing the skills gap, you talked about well-being, wellness. Sometimes this generation just need an outlet. That there isn't that relationship that perhaps I had with my bosses when I was starting out my career, which was in a professional services firm where we had very rigorous structured training, structured mentoring. And I'm setting up for this other question, what happens when all this goes away? But those well-being, I think, Kate, it's more than just a wellness thing, isn't it? It's actually again, I don't want to call it support. It's just part of the holistic, okay, we're not going to have potentially that really rigorous structured introduction to work life and guardrails. The well-being tools that you talked about, EAPs, the gym memberships, those kind of things, they're not frivolous fringe benefits. They're a core part of the holistic enabling of this new way of working. So I'd double down on that. But how do we address tenure? I've invested the first 2 years of this person's career in getting them over this hump. They're going to have 10 jobs. That means they're going to have an average of 3 years. What do we do to try and overcome that? How do we keep our employees?
Yeah, well, we alluded to earlier the fact that I think they view work as maybe a bit more of a transitory relationship because they often were joining the workforce during the pandemic and they saw just how quickly the employee-employer relationship could come to a close, unfortunately. So I think that the reality is they're probably always going to have one eye on the market and trying to understand what else is out there and whether or not there is a better offer, something that suits their needs more. So it's about making sure that you're sufficiently competitive. Interestingly, there's a lot of data that supports the fact that while Gen Z are very ambitious and motivated and they want a lot in terms of career development, they don't necessarily always have a huge appetite for managerial roles, at least not yet at this point in their career. So if I were thinking about how to retain them, I would really be thinking through what learning and development do we offer? How are we making sure that they are intellectually stimulated and that they are picking up new skills and maybe trying new things? It doesn't necessarily mean that they need a really formal promotion and that they are climbing the corporate ladder, so so to speak, depending on what industry you're in. It's more so that concept, I think, of ensuring that they feel that they are progressing in some sense, that they're learning new things, and that they're getting that support that you talked about that maybe is a bit less structured these days than it was how many years ago.
Yeah, and there's also a portion of this, like all generations, the level of autonomy. I'd say that Gen Z are willing to take on autonomy much earlier and have that responsibility for determining things. Whether they've got the ability is a different question. And that's sort of a segue back to one of the questions that I think has sort of called out. Yeah, it's really nice for us to say this generation's coming through where they're AI native, they're savvy on flexibility, they're used to adopting technology. But hey, my school leaver arrives day one for their first job, my graduate arrives day one for their first job. They don't really necessarily know what we do as a business. Um, they prefer to juggle multiple things. The attention and focus is not there. We all know at our beginning of our careers, there's a massively steep learning curve. I'm going to jump in with the first response to that, Kate, and hopefully you can provide a more considered approach. Depending on what your business is, depending on whether it's professional services, very niche, whether it's generalization, whether they're coming into a team that has very structured processes, standard operating procedures, all of that's going to determine the answer to this question. So I think I take this as a generalization. One thing that I have seen work successfully, it is not we don't necessarily do it in our business, and it's not for every business. I've seen businesses take in a lot of interns. So they're looking at these people in their late stage career, and I don't use the word intern with a capital I, work experience interns, school vacation work, whatever the circumstance. But where you have the opportunity to take in perhaps a broader range of potential candidates and introduce them to your business, because some of those people will be more adept to learning and adapting what's required to work in your business, in your industry. Where it works well, it's a great way of pre-screening and finding the candidates who are most able to overcome that steep career, and perhaps most interested and aligned to overcoming those careers. I think the second thing is, I alluded back to it in terms of my career, and I think you touched on it too, Kate, that very structured training. In the first 12 months of somebody's work life, in the first 12 months of joining your business, if it's very different from where they've come from, if you don't have a structured training program, but you're asking them to overcome this steep learning curve, to focus on your business and engage with your business over their poly activities that might be distracting them, there's a big opportunity for you as a business to implement that. So I think a structured training program, if you can lay out and say over the next 12 months, here's what we're going to expose you to, and here's where you're going to end up in 12 months, they'll be far more engaged because they're very goal oriented. They're very out. They want to progress. They want to see where they're going to be. If I put in this effort, what's it going to get me? So again, I'm not suggesting for a moment that this is an easy thing to do. But I think perhaps my number one tip, if you want to try and engage this generation, is lay out a plan for them, show them the way, give them an alternative to what else is distracting them. That would be my sort of number one tip. Kate, in terms of helping these early career transition?
Yeah, I think so just I can't recall if we sort of read the question out loud that we're responding to, but we're kind of speaking to the fact that they're not necessarily skilled yet, and if we invest a lot of time upskilling them and getting them on board in the first instance, and then they don't have great attention to detail and they end up leaving after 12 months, then
Another question, how do we engage with them when they're always 1 foot out the door, which I think,
yeah,
so
similar.
just to clarify, there's two sort of questions here. One is that one, how do we engage these people who are 1 foot out the door? And I'm not sure I agree with that statement, but I understand where it's coming from. And then the other question is, they've come on board, but they don't know what I need them to know. How do I get them up that curve when they're so distracted? Sorry, back to you, Kate.
Yeah, so something that's worked really well for us and that we actually use a huge amount over the last 12 months is what we find with younger employees is that they are also much more adept at being onboarded and trained in a different manner to maybe people from other generations. So I think there was once a time where you would start a new job, there'd be a group of you, you'd be in like a group induction session for maybe your first week, and you'd have a lot of kind of on the job learning and people going through slide slide decks and whatever for your first few days. These days, we actually use a lot of asynchronous training and onboarding to get people up to speed. So we might create content and then administer it via our LMS, or however else, depending on what your business setup is. And younger generations will be much more responsive to that and kind of digest that information asynchronously much better in our experience than perhaps some older generations. So while there isn't a one size fits all, maybe an appropriate thing to consider in terms of getting that generation up to speed quickly without having to constantly reinvest the same amount of time into upskilling would be really making use of that more asynchronous first mindset that generation is more familiar with and more comfortable with, frankly.
Yeah, and I mean you've touched on it, but using tools to be able to deliver that automatically without you having to reinvent the wheel every time someone comes through the door is really important. Now, obviously, there's always going to be situations where that face-to-face, one-to-one mentoring, training, guiding is appropriate. But I've been super, in fact, probably one of the biggest changes that I've noticed in our business over the past 2 years. And it's partly a function of the fact we onboard 50 new people a month. Every time I ask you, it goes up. And partly that we're now fully remote is the team that have built out our onboarding LMS service. So just to try and, you might correct me, but what I see that is it's very engaging. It's multimodal. So it's video, it's quizzes, it's reading and absorbing. But in the first week of your employment with Employment Hero, everybody undergoes, whether they're joining a leadership team or coming in as their first career job, they get the same experience. You go through and from the mission to the way of working, what we expect, how we work, the tools we use. It's a really comprehensive way of just getting people from knowing nothing about your business or ways of working and how you do stuff and the skills required through to being very productive very quickly. So I'd definitely plus one on your comment there about using the technology. And needless to say to everyone, the Employment Hero LMS platform and the onboarding tool that leads into it is ideally suited to that. Gives you full visibility on progress, completion, gets feedback, all that kind of stuff. So I strongly recommend that in that situation. Where are we heading, Kate? I think we've gone way off script.
We have. I think we've had a bunch of questions rolling through, and I'm super cognizant at the time. So I'm wondering if we should take a couple more questions, and then perhaps wrap up with what we think the most important takeaways are for everyone. So which question do you want to take next?
Oh, look, I think this one here, we know what Gen Z want from us. Do they understand what we want from them? Where did Gen Z see, what do Gen Z see as the value they bring to businesses and contribute? It's a really good question. I mean, I'm tempted to say, how's that any different to Gen X and millennials? It's a question for every generation. Do we accept the premise that this generation is different to previous generations in terms of the expectations on them? I'm not necessarily sure that I do. I think they do value their time, but they recognize that they need to deliver. I don't see, I personally, I haven't experienced it. I see our new employees, our emerging Gen Z, they're engaged, they're active, they want to contribute. We lay out the vision. We have the big light on the hill, the BHAG. We have our values, which are on the door behind me. We lay out all those things. I haven't necessarily seen personally any sort of deterioration in the obligations. Is that the right word that we have on these people? Have you, maybe in other businesses?
Yeah, I think maybe we'll come back to what we touched on earlier, which is the fact that it's a reciprocal relationship, and I think they're super aware of that. So yes, while there are certain things that they are requesting of their employers or prospective employers, whoever they may end up being, I don't think they're naive. I think they're super aware that there are also things that the employers need from them in order for it to be a successful working relationship.
I'm gonna lean into the premise and I'm gonna say, okay, let's assume that this generation is more entitled and less willing to, has a different reward and recognition, effort and recognition profile to previous generations. I'm not sure that's dramatically different, but let's assume that it is. Again, I'd come back to, you're providing the structure, you're providing the intro, you've got tools available to you. Let's be deliberate about how we onboard these people. So if the expectation is, oh, I also want to come back to outcomes. So if the expectation is that there are certain hours that they have to work, that there are certain meetings that they have to be at in spite of the flexibility we give them, first up, be really, really clear about what they are. And again, the tools are there to allow you to do this. Employment Hero has tons of great tools. There are other work assistance tools. Get the framework right, invest in the framework. We invested in chairs and desks and office square meters for centuries. We now have to invest in other tools as well to provide the framework. But what I wanted to touch on, Kate, was outcomes. You did mention it briefly. If you're operating on an input-based business management style, in other words, how many hours are you doing? How many tickets did you complete? How many pages of code, lines of code, or whatever did you put in? Then that's much harder in this environment to say, we had an objective, we had a goal. Did we actually get any closer to achieving that? This generation, I mentioned they're more willing to take on autonomy and responsibility. Give them that responsibility, but don't make it based on hours. Make it based on here's the goal. So try and set objective, measurable, SMART was the old acronym, specific, measurable, etc. Say in 1 week, in 1 month, in 1 quarter, we want to achieve this. And if they have better ideas, and our CEO always says, I don't mind people telling me that I'm wrong, but they've got to have the better idea. If they come back and say, actually, you know what, we can get there faster, sooner, better, with more certainty, whatever it is, and they have a great idea, embrace that. But set the goal. If you set the input, you're going to put a constraint around them. Set the goal. So it's much easier to say than do, but that's my advice.
Yeah. Fabulous. I'm really cognizant of the time, so I want us to finish up by both answering this question, which is, what's the number one thing that attendees should take away from this session today and apply immediately?
Um, wow. Yeah. Look, I think the fact that there, like all things that change in the workplace, which we experience with remote, and people are going to get sick of me saying this, we need to be deliberate about it. We need to be planned about it. I think if you just say, well, Gen Z have got to adapt to our way of working, and this is the way we've always done things, and they better get on board or else, two things are going to happen. Firstly, you're not going to hire great Gen Zs and you're not going to set them up for success. And the second thing is, because that generation is becoming a bigger and bigger part of our workforce, you're going to start to feel that in your team, in your retention, in your recruitment, etc. So that would be sort of my number one takeaway. You've got to be deliberate and find solutions. Don't expect what worked for the last 40 years to work for the next 40 years.
Similar. Yeah, I would say the big thing is just really acknowledging that the workforce is changing. Today we're talking about Gen Z, but we could also be having a conversation about AI or a million other different trends and things that are happening and shifting in the workforce at the moment. Technology has changed rapidly. People's attitudes towards work have changed and expectations have shifted is the synopsis. And if you want to capture any particular segment of the market or move with the times, you're going to need to be able to be happy to change and adapt based on what's happening and to iterate your ways of working. What worked before probably will not work again. There are so many different factors that are weighing in on that. So we ought to and need to be in sync and be adaptive to what's happening in real time would be my main takeaway.
Yeah, that's the other bit there is you can't just set and forget this, and this perhaps isn't a reflection on the generation, it's the world we live in. The technologies that are emerging, the shift in geopolitics in terms of the shifting of hemispheres, in terms of influence, markets, where we look to for leadership on some of this stuff around the world, that's all changing. So if you're trying to use the same practice today that you're going to use in 4 years' time, you're going to be dead in the water. I'm just answering a couple of questions here through the text. But yeah, that's my number one. I think we're very closely aligned on that, Kate.
Yeah. Fab. Someone has dropped into the Q&A that there's a book that they recommend, so maybe we can circulate that at the end. But we are coming to a close very shortly. So maybe we will start to wrap up with a final poll. Would love to know from everyone off the back of this conversation, do you believe that your organization has the appetite to make changes to attract and retain Gen Z talent? The options are yes, we're ready to shake things up and lead the change. Maybe we've discussed it, but actions haven't been taken. no, we are unwilling or resistant to change, or not sure is a conversation that we still need to have. Super curious what everyone is thinking about this and saying about this, and I'm sure the rest of the attendees will be as well. While everyone answers that, I just wanted to say a massive thank you to everyone for joining us today. Quick note to say that a survey will automatically launch after we end the webinar, and we would really, really appreciate it if you took a minute to please fill it in. We'll also be sending out some additional resources along with the webinar recording after today's session. And big reminder that the latest Employment Hero jobs report, which we've referenced throughout this conversation, is due to go live next week. So if you're interested in seeing the full report and findings, please go ahead and download it after the launch. There is always some really great data in there, not specifically just about Gen Z. There are a myriad of different trends that we touch on, and it's aggregated, anonymized, real-time data from over 300,000 businesses and 1.1 million employees that are served by the Employment Hero platform. So you get the most comprehensive and up-to-date information available. I'm going to go through the results of our poll now, which have just popped up. Do you believe your organization has the appetite to make changes to attract and retain Gen Z? Most popular answer was yes, we're ready to shake things up and lead the change. And that was 42%, followed secondly by maybe we've discussed it, but actions haven't been taken just yet. So I'd say off the back of this conversation, actually, Dutchy sounds promising and positive, and that actually a lot of people are willing to make the changes.
Are we doing more in this series, or am I just is this my last one?
I'm sure we will. I'm sure we'll do some follow-ups. I'm sure there'll be others that we put out there over the next few months. I'm not sure what we've got planned next, but we will be doing
Alan?
Talent Unlocked.
Yeah. So there's more coming. So keep an eye on the usual places and emails.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Really appreciate your time and insights. Dutchy, thank you as always for dialing in and sharing your views. Much, much appreciated. And I hope everyone has a fantastic rest of their day.